What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are going to be comparing two of Samsung's best budget phones for 2024, the A35 and the A55. Now, in a lot of ways, these two phones are super similar. I mean, just flip a coin and either way you land, you've got yourself an awesome smartphone with great specs and features for well under $500. But there are a handful of differences that set them apart. And depending on your budget, how you use your smartphone, and where in the world you live, you might wind up leaning towards one over the other. If you just want the quick summary, well, the A55 has the edge, of course, when it comes to overall performance and camera capabilities. If you push your phone really hard each day, are really into gaming, or will notice the little minute differences in image and video quality, then I do think the extra $100 or so makes the A55 totally worth it, if you fall into that subset of people. For everyone else, like 95% of the general population, the A35 is totally fine as is, and well worth its cheaper price. In fact, this year, I think the A35 is actually the better value overall, spec for price, but we're going to get into all that and more in just a little bit. First, let me touch on something really important. This year, here in the US and in some other parts of the world, Samsung is actually not officially selling the A55. They'd prefer you get the S23 FE or the flagship S24 instead, so if you go to Samsung.com right now or walk into your carrier store hoping to see this phone ready for purchase, well, it's not going to be there. However, it is readily available from third-party retailers and various authorized outlets like Amazon, and if you're on a supported GSM network like T-Mobile or Mint or Tello, you can get yourself this A55 and use it with no issues. Right now, the A55 is selling for a bit under $400. I've seen it as low as $360, and I would certainly consider that at least a mid-range price point, but bordering on budget. The A35, on the other hand, well, this phone is available everywhere from everyone. Samsung.com, Amazon, and all the carriers you can think of. AT&T and T-Mobile, the prepaids like Boost, Straight Talk, and US Mobile, even Spectrum has this. Prices are all over the board for the A35. The full retail price for this guy is technically $399, but I promise you're not going to pay that. On Amazon, it's available for as low as $308 unlocked, and all those carriers you saw have deals and discounts if you switch or sign up for a new line. It's $150 from Boost right now, 30% off from Spectrum, $300 off through T-Mobile with a new line, and I'm sure over the next few months, it'll continue to be offered with all sorts of additional discounts. Now, at a glance, these two phones look super similar. In fact, they're more or less identical with the same 6.6-inch display up front. Technically, the bezels, those black borders framing the display, they vary a little bit, leading to a slightly different screen-to-body ratio in favor of the A55, and the overall dimensions of the phones differ by a fraction of a millimeter in every direction, so you can't have the same case on both phones, by the way, but you're really not going to be able to tell them apart unless you knew exactly which one was which. At 6.6 inches, I think these phones are a great size, big enough to offer a great viewing experience, but still comfortable and familiar that I can use them one-handed for the most part with a little bit of maneuvering, and I think most people would be used to these size screens as well. Around back, both phones have the same Gorilla Glass finish. Actually, I should also mention that up front, they both have Gorilla Glass Victus Plus as well. The only difference in build is that the A55 has an all-aluminum frame, while the A35 is still plastic. But I gotta be honest, other than a slight weight difference in the hand, I can barely tell the aluminum and plastic apart. These are both incredibly premium looking devices that feel sturdy, and their design and materials mimic what you'd see on Samsung's $1,000 flagships. If you want to declare a winner for this category though, I think it's the A35, simply because getting a phone that looks this nice with this elevated build for close to $300 is such a great deal. And by the way, they're both IP67 water and dust resistant, so they're plenty tough too. There's nothing on the left sides of the phones. On the right, pretty much identical power and volume buttons. Up at the top, both phones have the physical SIM and micro SD card slots, and this is great. Not only can you run multiple SIM cards, including eSIM, but you can pop in an SD card and get up to 1 terabyte of extra storage for pretty cheap. Each phone can be configured with either 128 gigabytes or 256 gigabytes of onboard storage, which is also pretty decent for the price. specs, but having SD card support I think is still a big win for both phones. On the bottom, there's the same USB-C ports, bottom-facing speakers, and lack of a headphone jack. Selfie cameras and secondary speakers up top on both as well, and around back, surprisingly similar triple lens camera setups that we'll compare in just a bit. Both these phones have in-display fingerprint sensors for unlocking, and as far as I can tell, it's the same hardware and sensors. They more or less wake and unlock at the same time, or at least flip-flop on who comes out ahead, and they both have face unlock as well for a similarly speedy unlocking setup. When it comes to the display specs and overall viewing experience, I might get a little bit of flack here, but really, there's no major difference between these two phones. Their 6.7-inch displays are both Super AMOLED panels. They're both Full HD 2340 by 1080 resolution, and they offer an adaptive 120Hz high refresh rate option. That trifecta of features is pretty much all you could ask for in a display, especially ones that are found on these sub-$500 phones. And I always say with these higher tier A-series phones that the screens themselves are a huge value proposition overall. The AMOLED panels are vibrant, colorful, and plenty bright. They both peak at around 1000 nits of max brightness, which isn't quite flagship level, but much better than previous budget offerings. With the Full HD resolution, the screens look sharp even at this big size, and even with your nose pressed up against the screen, there's no issues there. And the adaptive 120Hz refresh rate gives you that super smooth visual and responsive taps and touches that you'll always find on those flagship phones. And it's something that I also think more people nowadays are starting to appreciate. In my opinion, the A35 once again comes out ahead here simply because for less money, you get the exact same screen as the A55, which, by the way, both these phones have almost the same screen as Samsung's S24. So again, I say just incredible overall value when it comes to the viewing experience, but for the A35 in particular, this is an exceptional screen for a $300 smartphone. For your out loud listening pleasure, I truly don't think there's any difference in the speakers here. They both have dual stereo speakers. There's the one big one at the bottom and the secondary one hidden inside the earpiece up at the top. I can't hear anything that sets them apart, but here's a sample from each. Maybe you guys will be able to pick something out. So when it comes to the internal specs and overall performance, this is really where we see the first considerable difference between these two phones. But like I alluded to at the start, depending on how you actually use your phone and what you expect to do with it each day, this may not be as big of a deal, or it could very well be the deciding factor. The A35 is powered by Samsung's own Exynos 1380 chip, and either 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM. The A55 is powered by Samsung's own Exynos 1480 chip, and also either 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM. First, here are the Geekbench scores, so you have some numbers to compare both between these two phones and maybe up against your own devices if you're considering upgrading. Both my phones here have 8 gigabytes of RAM, by the way, so keep that in mind. Now, there are people typing away in the comments right now, I'm sure, saying that they wouldn't buy either of these phones with the Exynos chips inside them. And if that's you, well, maybe an FE or a used flagship is a better option. If you aren't off-put by Exynos and you want to know the real-world differences between these two phones, well, there's two parts to this story. For most of the everyday stuff, basic communication, social media, video watching, web browsing, emails, work, school assignments, first-party, and even most third-party apps that the world uses on a regular basis, you are seriously not going to see a difference between these two phones. They launch and load apps just a fraction of a second apart, if that. They have the same RAM and manage apps in the background the same. There's nothing to me here that says that the basic Android experience and average day-to-day usage is better or worse on either phone. When you jump to the more intense apps though, especially the games, this is where the A55 pulls ahead. You're almost always going to jump into a game a few seconds ahead of the A35, no matter if it's a simple little game or something more graphics heavy. And in-game performance, while they're pretty similar in most instances, the A55 I think does have an advantage, especially if precision is key. I think in this particular instance, the folks who want the best possible performance will find the A55 to be worth the extra bucks, and maybe they'll even opt for something better and non-Exynos. For most everyone else though, the A35 is going to be more than capable enough to handle the average everyday stuff and even a little more. I personally don't feel that the variations in launch and load times is significant either way, but you may feel differently. And if that's the case, like I said, maybe an even more powerful phone is your answer. To be honest though, I think spec-wise, both these phones are still a great overall value, and they're miles ahead of the mid-tier A-series phones from a few years ago. By the way, for those of you concerned with software updates, both of these phones will receive 4 major Android updates and 5 total years of security updates. It's not quite as good as the 7 years of support on some other flagship phones, but for a $300 or $400 device, knowing you've got the latest software for all those years ahead once again makes these phones a crazy good value. As far as the batteries inside powering these phones, well, they're the exact same size 5,000 milliamp capacity, and they charge at the same 25 watt max wired speeds. No wireless charging on either, and in my personal experience, usage-wise, I don't see a huge difference in overall longevity. The A55 technically should have a slight advantage, since it has a newer, more powerful, and potentially more optimized chipset, but it really depends on your unique daily usage. They're all-day devices, no doubt, and I suppose if you want the sure thing, the A55 is the way to go, but I wouldn't buy either one of these specifically because of the batteries. I think they're more or less all the same. Finally, for the camera setups, there's actually quite a few differences across the board here. Both phones have a triple lens setup around back, and they each start with a 50 megapixel main lens, though the sensor on the A55's lens seems to be bigger and newer. The secondary lens on both phones is a 123 degree ultra wide, but again, the A55 has an advantage with its 12 megapixel lens versus the 8 megapixel on the A35. And they both appear to have the same 5 megapixel macro lens as the third. For the selfie camera, the A55 has yet another advantage here. It offers a 32 megapixel shooter, while the A35's is a 13 megapixel lens. Inside the camera app, the A55 actually does have a handful of extra shooting modes and options that aren't found on the A35, like dual front and rear lens recording, for example. But most everything else, from the high megapixel photo mode to the 4K video recording to the portrait options and night mode and OIS for video, that's all the same for each phone. You're really only going to notice the difference when you go out and start snapping some pictures. And the way I see it, the A55 does a better job overall getting the shots. The A55 captures more detail, due in part to its more powerful processor and likely newer, bigger camera sensor. There's better foreground and background separation with portrait pics. The colors look better and more natural, less over-processed. The A35 to me still toils with being a budgety looking camera with how artificial some of the shots look, while the A55 is almost always more natural, more detailed, and more pleasing. It's the better picture taker for sure, and with these side-by-side shots, you sort of have to decide how important this is to you. For me, I take a ton of pictures all the time, so a better camera is definitely worth an extra 50 or $100, and I think this is one of the main reasons to consider the A55 in general. So I have to say, in comparing these two budget bangers, I kind of sort of see why Samsung didn't bother releasing the A55 in the US. The A35 is totally good enough. And in fact, it's probably the better buy in this case when you consider all that it offers and what little more you get in opting for the A55 by comparison. But the A55 has those finishing touches. The better, more powerful specs, the better camera, the all-aluminum build, and I think for some people, spending the extra money is well worth it. I just think that group of people is rather small compared to the overwhelming majority who will thoroughly enjoy the A35 at its cheaper price. But what do you guys think? Which is the better buy overall, the A35 or the A55? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.